respective posts.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Frontline Club, and thank you for coming out on this freezing evening. Before I hand over to Paul Vallely, who's chairing tonight's discussion, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent. When it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting live. Over to Paul.
Good evening, everybody. We're going to talk about food tonight, and the reason that we're doing this subject at the moment is that the IF campaign, which launched recently, is working up towards the G8, and food is one of its key focuses. But we're going to broaden the discussion beyond that. We've got a wide-ranging panel tonight to talk about the issue. We're going to be starting with David Bull, who's at the far end there, who's the Executive Director of UNICEF, and he's had a wide-ranging experience in the developing world. I think he's worked in more than, or visited more than 60 different countries, and has worked on a whole range of things from human rights to development, project work, environmental work, and now he's working with UNICEF and focusing on children. Next to him is Mary Cray, who's the Labour MP for Wakefield and is the Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and has had a variety of jobs, including she's worked on issues like prevention of genocide, and she's been a government whip. Next to her is Mike Lewis, who works for ActionAid. He leads the policy there on tax in the developing world, and one of the key elements of the IF campaign is a question of tax justice and the business of making tax collectible in the developing world and collectible in the developed world, because tax evasion is a major issue. And next to me is Paul McMahon, who has worked on sustainable food systems in a variety of places. He's worked with the Prince of Wales unit on that, and the UN's Food and Agricultural Organisation. He's written a book called A Feeding Frenzy, the New Politics of Food, which he hasn't brought copies of with him, unfortunately. And he's also a partner in an organisation called SLM Partners, which invests in sustainable agriculture around the world. So a good wide variety of expertise here on this panel. We'll start off with David Bull from UNICEF.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's good to see so many people. It's a pleasure to be asked to be part of this panel. And I've worked in the development world for about 40 years. It's a bit scary, isn't it, to think it's quite so long. And as Paul said, I've visited more than 60 countries. And I remember when in the early days when I was working for Oxfam, we were in the heart of the crisis in Cambodia, where, you know, a million people were suffering from malnutrition. And I've been to lots of countries. In the last year, I was in Somalia, in southern Somalia during the famine crisis. And recently I was also in Kenya, where I met some nomadic pastoralist camel herders, and the man I met had his wife and children were in a camp for displaced people because their means of survival was no longer able to provide for them, and their father was taking his camels on a 5-day trek to find some grass for them to eat, and then 5 days back in the other direction to find some water for them to drink. And, you know, I think his story for me was a classic example of the impacts of climate change down to one family. And the people I met in Somalia had been walking for 3 weeks, 4 weeks with nothing to eat, and were arriving at a feeding centre that UNICEF was helping to provide. And if we weren't there to help them, they wouldn't have made it across the Kenyan border to the refugee camp, which was such a, you know, and still is such a huge place with so many people who've suffered so much. just recently I was in Uganda, and I was in Kampala in a slum area, and we went to visit a clinic where a lot of great stuff was happening to help families to cope with the malnutrition problems that were affecting their children. And there was one child there who I saw who really broke my heart, because everyone else seemed to be doing so well, but this one child was really thin and really hungry, and I was busily taking photographs, and I just couldn't face taking a photograph of this child because it was so awful. And the story was that the child was born HIV positive and hadn't been diagnosed and got treatment, and had obviously problems, diarrhea and so on, and was suffering from severe malnutrition. And, you know, throughout the 40 years that I've worked in the world of international development, I've always found hunger to be the most heartbreaking thing and the most unnecessary, the most tragic crisis that we see in the world, because the world has enough food for everyone. And the problem is that some people aren't getting access to that food. And every day that I've worked through those 40 years, I've been trying as hard as I can to do something about that. And I think the good news is that under 5 mortality rates, which are particularly associated with malnutrition, have come down dramatically over those 40 years. The bad news is that there are a lot of new challenges which we're facing in addressing hunger and malnutrition right now, which are beginning to reverse those gains. And it would be tragic, doubly tragic, if we allow that to happen. And one of those is that we've seen dramatic rises in food prices, and I think some of my colleagues here are going to go into some of the background to that. We've seen a dramatic increase in the frequency of natural disasters. I was looking at a graph the other day which showed that I think it was over about the last 20 years, the annual number of natural disasters caused by weather-related events, floods, droughts, and so on, had gone from under 400 to over 800 a year. And in UNICEF alone, we're dealing annually now with more than 300 emergencies every year. And that is, of course, connected with the impact of climate change, which is going to create more hungry children. And the estimates are that another 25 million malnourished children by 2050 if we carry on as we are. So the global financial crisis obviously isn't helping, and we're seeing a lot of countries cut their aid budgets, and it's harder for organisations like mine to find the resources to provide the help for those children that we desperately want and need to provide. And it's always the most vulnerable and the poorest who are the ones who suffer when anything goes wrong in the world, and the financial crisis has hit the most vulnerable children in developing countries hardest. And the result is that we now have more than 1 billion people that don't get enough to eat. And in 2011, 2.3 million children died unnecessarily as a consequence. At UNICEF, we're particularly concerned about the 165 million children around the world who suffer from the particular kind of malnutrition that we call stunting, which is in the first 1,000 days from conception to the second birthday, if they don't get the right nutrients in their diet, it can have a permanent, irreversible impact on their growth physically and mentally. So it will ruin their lives forever if they don't get the right help in those first important, vital 1,000 days. And it damages economies. If we could solve the problem of stunting, we would improve the GDP of the countries with the highest levels of stunting by 2 or 3%. And
could you come to a close there?
So, you know, these are the problems. And we know what a lot of the solutions are, but those solutions are going to take a lot of political will and a lot of money and a lot of commitment from the people who have the power in the world to make a difference. And we in UNICEF or our colleagues in ActionAid or Oxfam or Save the Children can't do this on our own. We believe that we have a big opportunity this year in the UK to make a difference to these questions. And so we've come together in the IF campaign to try to make that difference, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on.
Thanks very much. I'm going to ask Paul now to talk a bit about those macro economic factors that are leading to those food spikes, and to the bigger issues like we're going to have 9 billion people on the planet by 2050. Can we feed that number of people? Are we going to run out of food and water?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, headlines about the world food crisis have been very much in the media in the last 5 or 6 years. And I think that is good because it draws attention to something we've taken for granted for maybe too long, which is our food system. Having said that, the media is also full, I think, of myths, half-truths, and some dodgy statistics about our food system. So it's important to really understand how the system works and how all the different pieces interlock together. In my book, I try to do that, explain how the system works, why food prices are high now, and some of the challenges if we look for the next 30, 40 years. The simple answer to the question of can we feed a world of 9 billion is yes. We can do that now. We could probably feed 10 billion people now. As David said, there is enough food out there. It's a question of how it's shared and how it's accessed and how it's priced. And so it's a socioeconomic problem more than a biophysical problem. But that doesn't mean there aren't great problems facing the global food system. And in many ways it is broken and it does need to be fixed. And I'll just talk about what I think are the 3 key problems, as well as a 4th, which I think is actually a non-problem, or maybe not as big an issue as some people think. The first key problem is the perverse inequalities of the global food system. And David has already spoken about how 1 in 8 people in the world are malnourished and go hungry today, a shocking statistic. If we dig down who are those people, we find that about 75% are actually in rural areas, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a lot in India and other parts of South Asia, but they're mostly farmers or those who work on farms. And this is the open perversity. Those who are working to produce food themselves cannot feed themselves. And so ultimately we get down to a failure of rural development and agricultural development in these countries of the world. So it's not just a question of pricing and just being able to buy food, also being able to produce enough to earn enough income so that we have a level of economic development which will guarantee food security. On the other side, though, of this perverse inequality, we have rampant obesity, and about 1 in 5 people in the world are now overweight, and that's a chronic problem in rich countries, whether it's Europe, North America. It's becoming a bigger problem in the fast developing emerging economies in China and Asia and elsewhere. And that has a huge impact and cost on society, on health systems, and it's only growing. So we have the stuffed and the starved, these 2 poles of the system, both failing people, you could say. Second major issue is around the environmental impacts of modern agriculture. Farming can be a dirty business. It can erode soils, it can pollute water, it generates about 17% of greenhouse gas emissions. If you include deforestation in the mix, a lot of that's driven by agriculture, it goes up to about 30%. And these environmental impacts, they can harm the rest of society, but in the long term, they fundamentally undermine the basis of agriculture and food production. Because they undermine the soils and the water and the ecosystems that we need to produce food. And I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing shortages at the moment, because we are hitting up against some ecological limits. And whether that's running out of water in Saudi Arabia, or whether it's soils eroding in parts of India, it's a serious issue. A third problem, I would say, is the widening imbalances in the global food system, leading to more geopolitical competition. Because as I said before, all the science shows that we can feed 9 billion people. Where we can produce food and where we're getting the most population growth, the most amount, they're not evenly matched. And so we have areas where population is growing super fast, which are already hitting up against those limits of water, soils, and land, and other areas which have great potential for production. And as we move forward, those imbalances are going to widen further. In theory, if you talk to economists, they say that the solution to that is trade. So that's how we balance up the system. But if you look what's happened in the last few years, as we shifted from a period of relative abundance and low food prices to relative scarcity and high food prices, we've seen the opposite. We've seen a lot of competition. We've seen countries imposing trade bans so that they're domestic consumers can benefit from lower prices, even though that beggars and starves their neighbours. We've seen financial speculation, commodity markets, increasing volatility. We've seen corporations looking to acquire control over supply chains. And we've seen countries and governments, especially from the Middle East and Asia, looking to acquire land in some of the poorest countries in the world, so what's known as land grabs. And what we're seeing all over now is a race to develop captive supply chains, which will only make the world market thinner. And there's a risk that there's fewer crumbs fall from the top table to the poor and weaker countries that can't afford to do the same thing. So I think there are three very serious issues for the world. One, what is less of a problem, I think, is actually high food prices, ironically. It's often blamed for causing poverty, malnutrition, and a lot of problems. Biofuels are often mentioned in that context for driving up food prices. But actually, a lot of the people who are activists on this point of high food prices only 10, 20 years ago were complaining about the very opposite, which is low food prices, and that subsidies in developed markets driving prices too low. So I think that the pricing is a bit more complex. We need to understand the impacts it really has in those poorest countries. Just to give one example, China began its development process with an agricultural revolution. And that's between 1976 and 1980, food prices increased by 40% in China. That did not lead to more poverty, more malnutrition. It actually kick-started rural development, which then provided the fuel for industrial development later on. So we need to see in the context of rural and urban development, as a whole. I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks very much. Mary, you've done a lot of work on areas like food banks, and I owe to you the nugget, if I can put it this way, that chicken nuggets now have horse meat in them as well.
Only in Greece.
In Greece, yes. So I work on the supply chain as well, and there's a variety of issues I know you're going to touch on, so over to you.
Thanks very much, Paul. And I'll try not to repeat what our other two speakers have said. I want to start by talking about the role of politics and the choices that politicians made, because I think when we look at the food system, there are two basic problems, and the first is inequality and the second is poverty. And there's inequality in, as Paul said, in sort of socioeconomic terms. The social inequality is the poverty of women in the world, at home here, but also I visited South Sudan last year and was struck by the fact that women there are the primary producers of food but don't have any land rights, don't have access to any machinery, don't have any access to loans, to finance. So you have the primary food producers, small women farmers, who are fundamentally disregarded by their societies. They're also the people who have the children, so they have the primary responsibility for feeding their kids. And because of their poverty and inequality, they don't have access to health services, education services, and the ability to control their own fertility. So I start from the point of view of when we talk about 9 billion people by 2050, I always challenge that premise and say that's only if we're prepared to let women keep taking the crap. And I'm not, because I didn't come into politics to just sort of run the world a bit better and make the crap a little bit better. I came in to sort of try and change things. So I think that we don't have to assume population growth to the extent that is predicted. And that some of the things that David talked about in terms of the reduction in hunger and the access to markets, the things that transform women's lives and their children's lives are the ability to sell that tiny bit of surplus, to keep it, to dry it, to salt it, to trade it, and to keep a tiny bit of surplus so that they aren't one bad harvest away from starvation, because that is the situation for millions and millions of men, women and children in mostly sub-Saharan Africa, but also a large parts of South Asia. How do we do that? We do that by giving them, well, we're not in the solutions bit, so maybe I better not say how we do that.
Yeah, I've asked people to talk about the problems first, and then I'm going to throw the floor open to you to ask questions of the problems before they do the solutions.
Let's, a bit of self-censorship there, doesn't happen very often. So inequality and poverty, but those factors are also written large if we look at supply chains as well, and they are also factors in our own country. So we have an unequal food system in this country, which is where the large supermarkets, the large buyers, the big catering companies can force suppliers down and down and down, and the supermarkets hold the power, and the suppliers, have to compete, charge very low prices, and often then charge very low wages, pay very low wages in the agricultural sector. And I think the horse meat scandal has shown that supermarkets, in their race to always be the cheapest and always be the winner on price, have sort of definitely unconsciously, exposed themselves and their consumers to the horse meat fraud. So when they were going into burger companies and saying, we'd like you to bid for providing us with, 10,000 burgers a week, or however many a particular large supermarket would have, the margins on those types of products are typically 2 and 3%. And so when you have a supplier who comes in and says, well, we can undercut and we can deliver it for you 20, 30, maybe 40% cheaper, the supermarkets didn't ask why those companies were getting it so much cheaper and what the real cost of that meat was going to be. And the reason why they were getting it so much cheaper is apparently it was, a percentage of it was horse, which trades at between a quarter and a third of the price of beef. And those criminal networks were passing off horse as beef, and that then exposes mostly poor people, but not always poor people, to meat that is supplied by criminals, which I don't think any of us would like anybody to be eating. So I think there's an issue around inequality and poverty in our own country, and we know from the Trussell Trust that 290,000 people will have been fed by them by the end of this financial year, which ends in the next 4 days. We know that 6,000 people have been referred by job centres to food banks this year. We know that mothers are adopting a range of coping strategies to keep within their family budget, so putting things back at the checkout, skipping meals, turning up to their mothers' houses accidentally on purpose at tea time to make sure that their children are fed and pretending that they've eaten themselves. And I've had conversations with women at food banks across the country, pretty heartbreaking stories about the mechanisms that they've used. And they've told me about the problems of being fed by a food bank. So you get cereal one week, but you don't get milk. Back to the micronutrients and the nutritional recession that our children are experiencing in this country, there may not be orange juice or apple juice. So, the things that you're getting out of canned foods may not have the same nutritional high quality as fresh fruit and veg. And I think there's a problem that the government is unwilling or unable to address, which is this issue of food poverty, a much stronger benefit sanctions regime, which is pushing thousands of women and children into poverty, and meaning that families who are losing their tax credits are being pushed into poverty, but because they don't have tax credits, they can't qualify for free school meals. So again, in those families, they won't be spending £10 a week on free school meals. They'll be sending their child to school with a lunchbox. And again, there's question marks about the inadequacy of those lunchboxes from a nutritional point of view. So we know that there's an issue with inequality and poverty, both whether it's South Sudan, Sub-Saharan Africa, the UK. We know that there's a problem with the supply chain. At its worst, it's criminal adulteration. But in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's about things rotting in the ground. We know that there's an issue about buying stuff and throwing it away in our own country. And we know that there's an issue, as Paul has said, with commodity speculation. And when we come on to the solutions, I'll be happy to share with you some ideas that we have on those.
Thanks very much, Mary. Mike, one of the key statistics that came in the IF campaign, which I thought was particularly shocking, was that the amount of tax lost by developing countries to tax havens from multinational companies operating in their area is 3 times the global aid budget. So tax is a key issue. It's not something that is at the forefront of people's thinking about development or about food. But Mike, would you like to say a bit more about this?
Sure, yeah. As Paul said, I'm probably the imposter on this panel because I'm not a food expert. I'm essentially a financial and tax investigator. So I want to explain a little bit about how my work and this part of our campaign connects back to the food system by telling you a little bit about one of my very rare visits to a farm. So as somebody who was born and raised in London and almost never goes near either end of a cow, it's quite a shock for me. So I was in Nigeria with my organisation ActionAid in July of last year, and one of the places where we work is in Ondo State. It's an agriculturally rich state, and in a village called Oloruntido-Awe, we work with an agricultural cooperative run by a lady called Hafsat Olosunkanmi. And Hafsat has acquired some land for her cooperative. They grow cassava, both to eat and to take to market. They have acquired a palm oil press to take palm oil to market, and they also grow cocoa for basically for sale for onward processing. They dry the beans and then sell them to middlemen. She's lucky because her farm is 45 minutes away from one of West Africa's largest cocoa processing plants, Stanmark, just down the road in Akure. The problem is that there is no sealed road between Oloruntido-Awe and Akure. She can't afford to move her cocoa beans to the plant to sell them properly, so she sells them at another market 12 miles away to an agricultural middleman who works for one of the major multinational agricultural commodity traders, who then sells it on to the processing plant 45 minutes down the road from Hafsat's farm. She has no electricity, so they have to buy diesel for all their generators, including for the palm oil plant. There's no clean water provision in her village. There's a solar-powered borehole that's been broken for over a year. The ironic thing is that Hafsat has already paid for the infrastructure that would enable her to have proper market access for her agricultural goods. She pays a range of local taxes. She pays 20 naira for each bag of cocoa beans she takes to market. She pays a local levy on her shop in the village, tenement rates into a community purse, which is supposed to pay for the food and drink for the people who come to fix the road or don't. Meanwhile, if it expands, the foreign-owned cocoa factory down the road, under proposed new Nigerian investment incentives, will enjoy a 20-year tax holiday on all of its profits. That's investments over $5 million. So what that taught me, that little trip to the farm, it taught me 3 things for a non-farmer. It taught me that access to markets and the benefits of agricultural investment are only meaningful with all of the kind of publicly funded infrastructure and other public services that makes smallholders' access to those global markets possible. Secondly, it told me that the way that revenues are raised for that public investment in agriculture and everything else that goes along with it, infrastructure, social protection, nutrition programs, the way that those revenues are raised is meaningful for market access in itself. Part of the reason that she can't compete with middlemen is because she's not on a level tax playing field. And finally, it taught me that it's very easy to talk about raising resources for all of the things we're talking about tonight, all of the public investment we're talking about tonight. It's easy to talk about raising revenues through tax for those things. But what happens when, as in some parts of Nigeria, essentially the contract between state and citizen has broken down, and you can't be reliant upon tax revenues being used to help people like Hafsat. So those are 3 very kind of slightly glib lessons to learn on the farm, I suppose. But what it taught me in terms of the IF campaign is, and the campaign to end hunger, is that if we're realistic about being able to pay for the publicly funded parts of what we want, then we have to do 2 things. First of all, we have to make sure that developing countries are raising their own revenues for public investment, including the drastically collapsed public investments in agriculture that's happened over the last decade. And that tax has to be raised equitably, partly through tackling tax avoidance and evasion from the largest taxpayers. We recently released a report about a UK-headed food multinational, ironically, and we found our calculations suggest that the tax that that company is avoiding in just in one country, Zambia, through tax haven transactions via Ireland, the Netherlands, and Mauritius, is enough to pay for half of all the micronutritional interventions needed to tackle that part of the malnutrition problem in Zambia. That's a country where 45% of all children are malnourished to the point of stunting, where a third of all child deaths are related to undernutrition. The amount of tax that they were dodging every year was 2.5 times the money set aside in the Zambian budget for nutritional interventions. So there are pockets of, if you like, untapped revenues that we can use for the things we want to pay for, and it affects things like market access as well. And the second half of what we have to do is, of course, to make sure that those revenues are spent transparently and in a pro-poor way, and that's true in the UK as it is in Nigeria, as it is in Zambia, anywhere else. That's about budget transparency as well as corporate and tax transparency. It's about citizens having access to the way in which governments are spending money, both at the
I think you're creeping into solutions here, Mike.
Sorry, yes, okay.
So I'm going to stop them there because I want to give you the chance to either ask some questions or to raise some points of issues which you think are key to the food crisis, which we haven't touched on here. And if it's a point rather than a question, can you make it a short one, please? So can we see some hands? Don't be shy.
Hello. I want to ask a question.
Could you just say who you are so we know what your background is?
My name's Michaela. I'm a postgraduate student at SOAS. I wanted to ask both, I think, Paul and Mike, about how you see the role of multinational corporations in all this. I think there's a lot of scope. I mean, both of you have kind of implied that they are necessary, and at the same time have kind of highlighted some of the dangers they bring. So if you could expand on that. Thanks.
Paul, do you want to go first?
Yeah. So yeah, we live in a capitalist economy, and therefore we will have corporations. So I don't think we will get rid of them. I think that I spent a lot of time looking, for example, at the grain traders, so the ABCDs, the Bunge, Cargills, Louis Dreyfus, Archer Daniels Midlands, who together with Glencore, which is a G, control about 80% of the world's grain trade. And they get blamed for a lot, actually, for driving up food prices, taking advantage of farmers and so on. I think there are examples where that can happen whenever they have too much market power. So if you have one buyer and lots of little farmers, and the UK suffers from some of these problems in a more diluted form, those companies will take advantage and they will drive the price down and try and increase the margin. So absolutely, I think you need to have governments coming in and regulating so there's always competition between buyers, so the farmers getting a fair deal. Fully agree with Mike's points about tax avoidance, because actually, that's one of the core, in a way, business propositions of multinational corporations, is the ability to structure themselves so they avoid paying tax. The commodity firms are some of the worst offenders. Most of them have their main trading businesses in Switzerland, and they're not there for the deep water ports, because Switzerland's a great producer of cocoa, coffee, or grains, but because it's a very favourable tax situation. So yeah, they're super clever at shuffling money around the world so that they pay the minimum amount of tax, and a small farmer, a small business even, just doesn't have that advantage.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I've got much to add to that. I think for every multinational that we create a villain out of, there is a multinational who is working really hard on their supply chains, who's working really hard to connect with people low down the chain. I think when you're talking about issues around so-called foreign business in other countries, my sense is that they come in sort of two flavors. There are multinationals who have, who are actually quite, transparent about what they're doing. You may not like what they're doing, but they're quite kind of transparent and open about what they're doing, whether that's about reorienting agriculture towards, export markets when you think they should be producing more food for the domestic markets, for example. And that's one of the issues around biofuels, for example, where, you've got places like Senegal, which is a cash poor country which is importing 60% of its food needs, and you've got a huge rush of multinational investors coming in to buy land almost entirely to export food grains, both food crops rather, both as agricultural commodities, but also for fuel. So that strikes me as as an odd thing. But then there's a kind of second flavour of foreign business investment that is completely opaque. And this is often the case, for example, with large natural resource deals or land deals, where you've got, it's almost impossible actually to tell sometimes who are the investors behind, the corporate vehicles who are buying this land or who are buying a mine or, making investment of that kind. And it's that second payoff, that knowing who owns what, that beyond all the kind of the revenue-raising possibilities of tackling tax havens and tackling tax avoidance, it's that knowing who owns what that is about making sure that local communities, for example, are able to tell who are the foreign investors who are coming in and buying land and excluding them from access to that land. So there's a kind of two flavours to that problem, I think.
Thanks. David?
Can I just slightly disagree? I think, it's all too easy to talk about companies as goodies and baddies, and actually they're mostly shades of grey of one kind or another. And I think what's important is that we set some standards which we expect them to adhere to, and we hold them to account for adhering to those standards. And those might be standards which ideally at some point would be incorporated into law in the countries where they operate. But there's a lot of discussion and debate these days about the role of the private sector in development. And, for the first time in the discussions about the post-2015 development goals, we've got Paul Polman from Unilever sitting on the panel. So the private sector is very much engaged in the development debate in a way that it wasn't when the current set of Millennium Development Goals were being developed. In UNICEF, together with other partners, we've developed something called the Children's Rights Business Principles, which tries to set out the standards which we expect companies to adhere to in their roles as in terms of the workplace, the marketplace and the environment in which they operate, to make sure that the benefits of corporate engagement as employers, as investors, as taxpayers can be maximised, and the disbenefits in terms of problems in supply chain, labour standards, environmental damage and so on, selling unsuitable products and goods for children, marketing things in a way that particularly undermines breastfeeding, which is a big issue in terms of child undernutrition. If we can get them to adhere to those standards and to be held accountable for them, I think that's what we have to do, recognising the potential they have to contribute positively to development, making sure that they don't contribute negatively.
What's the name of those standards?
Children's Rights and Business Principles. So they were produced by UNICEF and the UN Global Compact and Save the Children, a partnership of those three organisations.
Mary, do you want to add anything on multinationals?
Yeah, I mean, Unilever wedged its Lifebuoy soap logo into the chapatis at the Kumbh Mela in India. And it did this amazing piece of corporate branding because it wants people to buy soap. I like Lifebuoy. I'm old enough to remember Lifebuoy. And it's one of those great British brands that's gone overseas and is sort of still surviving. And I want kids and families in India to be able to wash their hands and get their hands clean so that they're not passing on diarrheal diseases and viral illnesses to each other. And Unilever realises that as the world develops, new markets are created. And I think it's very positive that they are engaged, and I think they are much more focused on the long term than many governments are, including Western governments, in terms of sustainability around their supply chain. I know Nestle gets a bad press, but and it's just withdrawn its kit chunky because of some plastic bits in it, which is very bad news, and shows that I'm right to stick to my conservative four-finger bar. But they, when I visited their factory in York last year, they're doing all sorts of innovations around different types of cocoa plants, and they also are getting their cocoa farmers in Ivory Coast over into the plant in York to kind of foster that relationship between the two communities. So, you know, as globalization brings us all together, I think there can be a positive role for multinationals to play, but it's clear that not all of them are doing it, and the role of governments and governance in making sure that they have their own internal structures to make sure that they're not abusing their position, and that governments are acting to prevent market abuses is absolutely key.
Any more questions? There's a hand there.
Hi, my name is Mary Holmes. I'm involved with a small UK-based charity called Action Village India. My question's about small farmers, but I grew up in a Hampshire village, which was fairly near Southampton, and people who were farmers, and not particularly well-off farmers when I was young, they sold their land, somebody else built some houses on it, and everybody became very happy and prosperous, and now people can't afford to live in that village. You know, that's fine in the UK because there are other jobs, and I suppose we buy in our food. You know, what is going to happen in India? Because people can sell their land, and they're encouraged to do it. There's all sorts of developments going on, urban developments, factories, mines, you all know the kind of things. Also, to some extent, agribusiness. And, you know, they don't get much for that land. They go and join slums on the edge of enormous cities. There are no jobs for them, really. I mean, you've got a whole 70% of the population in India still are rural, you know, and when you read things by charities, they say that future should be small farmers. But, you know, economically, that's not really going to happen, is it? Because anybody can afford, you know, everybody here this evening could go and buy half a dozen farms, probably, and, you know, not really miss the money. You know, so what rules are there to stop this? When I had a look at this on the internet, there's some sort of stuff about rules being made about people selling land. You know, what kind of rules are there? Do governments prevent it?
Paul, do you want to tackle that? And it's also the question of urbanisation, I suppose, if David, you want to have a go at that?
Sure.
Yeah, well, India actually does have quite strict rules about who can buy land and can't buy land. So certainly as a foreigner, you wouldn't be able to come in and buy it. I do think smallholders are the solution for you know, most parts of the world, the developing countries, who already have 50 to 75% of their peoples in agriculture. Well, you have to start there, and they'll start with small farmers. As you go through a process of economic development, you tend to get a gradual shift from small to medium and even to large-scale farmers as people shift out of agriculture into industry. And that's what happens in Europe and North America, and it's happened everywhere. And in many ways, India and other countries like that need to go through that process. I think you can accelerate it to an extent, but I don't think you can leapfrog too many steps in the process without leaving a lot of people behind, ending up in slums and suffering greatly. I think your point, though, about India is the one part of the world I worry about most. When I was writing my book, you hear a lot about China and how we feed China. But actually, if you look at the demographics of India, it's quite frightening. There'll be 450 million more Indians in the next 40 years if current trends continue. And fertility programs may reduce that a little, but a lot of it's locked in, just given the number of young people that are in the country at the moment. 9/10 of the land is being used. And big areas of India have huge problems with water. All over in the Punjab, they're pumping the water out of the aquifers, and the water tables are dropping. So I think India has some real challenges, and it's probably going to become a much bigger food importer than it is at the moment.
Yeah, I think the question of rural-urban migration is a really important one, and we often seem to forget about the urban poor when we're talking about hunger and malnutrition. But they don't escape it by any means, and UNICEF did a study in Bangladesh recently looking at the urban slums in Dhaka, and found that most of the indicators of child well-being in terms of health and education and so on were worse in the urban slums than they even were in the rural villages from which those people originated. And we've been doing some work in India on actually helping to address malnutrition problems in urban areas, in urban slum areas, where there's a lot of adulterated food sold to people, where people are often eating things which are not giving them the children the nutrients which they require, and where things like rates of breastfeeding are often lower than they are in the rural areas. So I think there is
How does that square, though, with what Paul was saying earlier about most of the poverty, most of the food poverty being in rural areas.
Well, I think it challenges a little bit what you're saying. I mean, you know, the high food prices are a real problem for the urban poor, and I think we have to see that in a world in which we're seeing rapidly rising food prices and a great deal of volatility, which has an adverse impact on the producers as well. Food prices are a problem, and they are helping to exacerbate malnutrition, particularly in urban areas, but also in rural areas because of the price volatility, which makes it very difficult for small farmers to plan their planting and harvest, especially if they're producing cash crops.
That's
I
not
think it is a
exactly
problem.
true. That might be true in sort of stable societies like Bangladesh, but when you're dealing with sub-Saharan countries where they have security issues as well, that isn't true, because you have greater food security in a city where you're next to the trade and where there's just little bits that you can grab than if you're out in the wilds of Rumbek in South Sudan and you have to up sticks, go somewhere. There is nothing in the Nuba Mountains for the people who've gone there. There is no aid, there is no UN, there's absolutely nothing there. There's a few cattle raids. And so I think what works in stable societies where UNICEF can organise its programmes is totally turned on its head in insecure situations like Congo. Over 1 million internally displaced people displaced from 1 month to the next, just on the move constantly. And if you're not next to a city, you've got absolutely no chance.
So conflict is another factor. I can see your question here, which I'd like to take before we move on to the next part of the...
So my name's Lara. I'm a journalist, but I've worked for an NGO that looks into issues of land grabbing. They're called La Via Campesina, and they're a farmers' rights movement. And I want to talk about land grabbing. I'm glad to see that it's mentioned in the IF campaign, but I would like to ask, what are the roles and responsibilities of Western aid agencies and governments and international bodies in making sure that countries apply these voluntary commitments agreed on land investments? Because at the end of the day, companies who are needing investment are going to make the terms as good as they can, and countries like Ethiopia or Zambia or Mali are not going to be able to say no to these companies. And are we not, by encouraging increased commercialization of development, are we not creating another system of plantation-based farming whereby we're allowing companies to simply grow our food for export, whilst people who were previously farming are now no longer have access to food markets?
Thanks very much. Mary, do you want to tackle the question of how, it's a political issue of how we enforce these kind of standards, and both either politically or as civil society to put pressure on these people?
Well, I think it's really hard, isn't it? It's a massive challenge, and it's different in every country. Every country makes its own laws, and it's not for Western countries to say how those laws should be made, enforced. There's clear evidence of land grabs. When I was visiting the Congo, I went and visited the Pygmy people, the Batwa people, and they were in the middle of the forest, and it had all been chopped down, and there was a tree plantation and a plantation of tea, and they were all picking this tea. And I said, well, how much do you get paid? And they said, we get a bowl of flour a day. That's our wages. And I said, oh, and where do you live? And they said, well, this is our village. But we don't sleep here at night because that's when the robbers come. So when the robbers come, we go out and sleep underneath the tea plants because it's safer there, because they can't find us there. And we know our way around the plantation. So what you had there was land bought by an investor, could have been a Congolese investor, could have been a foreign investor, effective slave labour, because these people couldn't go anywhere, child stunting. Forget about bed nets. They weren't even sleeping in their huts. So this little child that I saw was on his mother's back, and I said, oh, has he got the measles or something? He was absolutely covered. And they said, oh, no, that's just mosquito bites. So, forget anything about, human development. And the chief had a mobile phone around his neck, and it was like, well, who do you call when you're hiding under a tea bush and the robbers are coming? And the robbers are, of course, the M23, they're CNDP then, they're M23 now, and of course the Congolese army. So there's nobody to call when you're in that sort of situation. And it's very difficult, as the panel has said, to work out who owns the land, and it can be sold once, twice, sometimes 3 times in certain countries, which can cause all sorts of problems for decent companies who want to come in, create employment, and want access, whether it's to minerals or whatever, and want to create employment and development in that area. So, I mean, that's probably an extreme case.
Paul, do you want to?
But we can also ask our supermarkets how their supply chains are operating and whether they're confident. And I think auditing supermarket supply chains has worked very well on fair trade. I think it could be a model to use for land grabs.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one, because I actually think there's not too much Western aid agencies and governments can do about this, because most of the land grabbing that's going on is actually being carried out by Middle Eastern, South Asian or East Asian governments and companies, and that's where the majority action is happening in direct deals with governments in Africa and other developing countries. So it isn't so much a Western issue. There was a spate of Western companies investing in biofuel projects in Africa.
Yeah, Italian companies, for example.
Sorry?
Yeah, Italian companies.
And it's so Italian, UK, French, American. Almost all those deals have failed actually, and they've just fallen over because actually the economics of making these large-scale land-grabbing plantation investments in sub-Saharan Africa are not very good. It's not a very good investment to make, and there's lots of history showing why that's the case. The people who are going to stay the course and keep these investments going are those who are doing it for food security reasons, and they actually don't care too much about how much it costs. They're not looking to make an economic return, and that's the thing where the real risk lies, because you get these farming enclaves which are being carved out now in parts of East Africa, particularly, where even there's one example that the Saudis negotiated terms whereby the local laws of Sudan would no longer apply to the workers of that farm. So it looks like a colony. I think that is an issue, and I think it's going to be very hard for Western governments actually to influence that directly.
I'm going to move on now. There are lots of issues we haven't talked about. We haven't talked about waste, which could have come up. We haven't talked about biofuels. There's a whole array of things, but I want to curtail the problems to try and move on to solutions. And I'm going to ask Mike if he'll start from his particular perspective on governance, transparency, tax. What are the solutions, Mike?
Okay. I think one thing is to say is that we have to be realistic that we can't tackle everything that makes the food system broken. We certainly can't tackle everything that fuels hunger and poverty, which is again a slightly larger frame. So I think for us, I'd pull out some of the gains and achievements that we might make this year, and particularly in the UK, and particularly at the G8 summit in June. Now, the G8 has had questions asked about its legitimacy as a kind of world committee in recent years, particularly with the rise of the G20. That said, there's both a kind of practical reason to harness that particular configuration of countries' particular political and economic weight to tackle some of these problems, but also, I think a kind of moral weight on the G8 to justify its continued existence, particularly in relation to the G20, by putting itself out to deal with some of these hard things. So I think on the kind of financing and transparency side, we've seen already in the UK genuinely extraordinary commitments on aid that I think probably we're going to talk about a little bit later on. One of the features of the G8, interestingly, in terms of both tax and transparency, is that 40% of all tax havens are jurisdictionally or diplomatically connected to G8 countries plus the EU. So they're in a particularly good place to deal with some of the issues around financial flows, illicit financial flows, tax, and transparency, with all of the kind of payoffs that we think that might produce, not only for the ability of governments to raise revenues for some of the things we've been talking about, but also the kinds of I hesitate to say corporate transparency, but in terms of being able to know, as I said, who owns what, which is a critical thing, particularly when you're talking about land. So two things that I think the G8 could do in that arena is look at setting standards for the real ownership of assets and companies, and by extension then the kind of corporate vehicles that are used to buy land. and secondly, to make sure that tax authorities in the poorest countries get access to information about those kinds of corporate vehicles, particularly in tax havens. So that's one area of progress that I think we'd be excited to see. The other is about specifically about land transparency, and in terms of particularly in terms of moving beyond some of the UN voluntary principles that you mentioned, to have some kind of formal systems, particularly for requiring the disclosure and registration of land deals, who's involved, what kind of conditions attached to contracts, those kinds of things.
Is there much in the way of aid and development policy that focuses on building tax strength in developing countries?
There is, and increasingly, particularly from the UK, there was a commitment from Justin Greening, the International Development Secretary, just last week, to put another £3 million in, particularly in Southern Africa, for building these kinds of capacities. But capacity building of tax authorities has been going on for some time. It's generally very good work, but it's of limited impact without tax authorities being able to access the information that they need in order to gather revenues properly, particularly from non-residents, including investors, including land investors, and without the international rules really working in their favour in terms of preventing the kinds of shifting of profits out of developing countries that we see just as much, if not more, than we see in terms of some of the high-profile internet and beverage companies that have been in the news recently in the UK. So there is good capacity building work going on, but
is that capacity building work focusing on collecting tax from the local population or from external companies?
It varies, to be honest, and I think this comes back also to the role of this question about the role of multinationals in development. It's clear that taxing multinational companies of all kinds is quite a quick win for developing country tax authorities, because basically you have to tax a relatively small number of very large taxpayers. So if you're saying where do you put your resources, do you go after 20,000 tiny businesses or 50,000 small farmers, or do you go after the corporate taxation of 50 major companies? Then I think the answer is, in revenue-raising terms, the answer is you go after 50 major companies. And I think there's good equity reasons for that as well. But it's not realistic to think that all of the things that we'd like developing countries to be able to pay for and free themselves from dependency can be paid for just from corporate taxation alone. So there has to be, in that path towards domestic revenue mobilisation, there has to be a component of, if you like, real domestic taxation as well. And it's important that that's done in as equitable and as pro-poor a way as possible. And the other thing that I would say is just that whenever you go to any African or South Asian or Southeast Asian country, the thing that hits you first when you arrive is not really levels of poverty, it's staggering levels of inequality. And what that means is that it's, in some senses, there is going to be very hard choices made about how developing countries begin to tax their own wealthy and increasingly transnationally mobile elites as well.
Thanks very much. Mary, do you want to have a go at solutions from...
Sure, I just want to pick up on the tax thing. I remember when I was in Rwanda, that one of the things the British government was most proud of was the fact that we sent a couple of people over with a couple of computers and set up their tax authority and invested in people being there for 2 years, got their systems and processes up and running. It cost us 20 million and had paid for itself 3 times over in its first year of operation. It's one of the very few sort of African countries that, and I don't think it was about the multinationals, because I'm not sure how many multinationals were heading into Rwanda in those very early days after the genocide, but they were certainly, you've got a landlocked country, so all you had to do was put a little tax on everything that came in and a little tax on everything that went out, and you're rocking and rolling. Obviously there are big issues in other areas of Rwandan life, but certainly the tax thing is an absolute model for East Central Africa, and sadly not been replicated by any other countries as far as I could see in my travels there. We talked a little bit about the footprint of farming, and that's a big issue in terms of our own farming footprint and soil degradation as much as it is in developing countries. And we're global leaders in the UK on the biological sciences, on smart ways of getting more out of soils and getting more out of our land. We've seen some exciting experiments, I think, with countries like Vietnam with their sustainable rice intensification program, where they're starting to get huge increases in the yields of the rice that they're planting through better selection of the plants that they're producing. They plant them further away from each other so they have a better root system. Because they are planted further away, you need less water. They grow quicker, there's less waste because they don't die. And I think there's lessons that we can learn in our own agricultural systems. And it's clear that even within the UK, there's massive variation between the amount of tonnes per hectare that wheat farmers are producing. So even in our own country, we can, to get everyone else up to the level of the best, through better learning and agricultural extension services, which is sort of very unfashionable, we could do a lot more to produce a lot more from the same land, and that's without getting into discussions around genetic modification. I'm interested in the fact that government at every level spends £2 billion a year buying food for hospitals, schools, councils and the public sector. And I think the horse meat scandal has shown us that all of the reassurances and high levels of trust that we have in our food sector need to be looked at again, and we need to start from the bottom up. And I think we also need to look at how we help the small businesses, the small innovative wealth creators and job creators in our own country to compete and be part of that public procurement system, rather than always just going to massive catering suppliers. And there's lots of examples from particularly school food procurement where clever purchasing managers have shown us that they can buy local, they can support local butchers, they can cut out the middleman, they can mince their own beef, and they can make sure everything's horse-free, and provide great quality meals for children and get children excited and thinking about food without breaking the budgets that they have. So I'd like to see us buying more locally and supporting more of our smaller scale producers, rather than just constantly going through the big catering suppliers. I think the Food Standards Agency needs to be, it's been dismembered by this government. The government took food labelling back into central government, into DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. It took nutritional labelling responsibilities away from the Food Standards Agency and put it into health, and it's made sort of broken the system that we had, and I think we need to fix that system around the whole regulation of food and make it a one-stop shop again, and make sure there's a coordinated approach across the food system. We in the Labour Party are looking at ideas around how we can use our waste system so that we have a food waste hierarchy and have zero food waste to landfill. Obviously, it makes no economic sense to have farmers growing these crops, watering these crops, putting highly carbon-intensive fertilisers on these crops, transporting them in lorries, refrigerating them in supermarket warehouses and in the shops, and then us taking them home, and then for us to, for them to be then thrown into landfill where they then give out greenhouse gases. So we're looking at how we can compost more in our homes, but also how we can cut out the waste that happens in that food supply chain, where farmers are seeing their things rejected by supermarkets, and where supermarkets are wasting it in the supply chain. So we need to get much smarter at how we do that, and we're quite interested. We're working closely with a couple of the big supermarkets on that. And finally,
what do you mean by hierarchy in that sense? Food waste hierarchy?
Well, in stores at the moment, if you have a big pallet and there's an accident with a forklift truck and a couple of the coffee jars get broken, the whole thing is treated as shrinkage. So all that coffee that's come from all over the world is binned effectively, and it's treated as refuse. innovative charities like FareShare, based down in Lewisham in southeast London, will unwrap that huge pallet, will take out the broken bits. The rest of it's absolutely fine for poor families to have and to use. And we think there's a lot more. Most of the food waste actually occurs in the supply chain and in those warehouses. And so linking up those warehouses with where people need food, we think, is a way of doing that, and it's a smart way to do that as well, without cannibalising supermarkets' own customers as well, because we want people to still go into shops and spend money. So to try and get to a position where, you know, I'm not talking about the sort of out-of-date stuff that comes out the back of the skip. I'm talking much more about working much smarter, higher up the system. I know the skips are the kind of symbols, but actually that's the tiny bit, and you can't feed a family on, you know, some past its use-by date hummus and off meat. You know, that's not what I aspire to in terms of, you know, we've got to get it out of the system where the waste is occurring. I'm less concerned about the stuff at the end of the system. I'm concerned about the waste that there is in the system, and farmers being told, we don't need this crop, or you're too late with this crop. We need more flexibility in those supply chains to eliminate that waste. We also talked a little bit about commodities and the amount of money that's in commodity markets. You know, food has just become a commodity, and it's sold as a financial product by Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Barclays. And in America, the Dodd-Frank legislation that's come in has put in position limits on that. And our Treasury team is actively looking at that in terms of what we can do to reduce some of the price volatility and speculation. We think probably you need about 30% of capital in the market in order for it to work properly, and there's evidence that over-financialisation of commodity markets actually impedes their good functioning, so that's not in anybody's interests.
Thanks very much.
I was just going to jump in, sorry, but actually the horse meat scandal is a really interesting one for us, because it connects up the kinds of struggles around the transparency and regulation of the supply chain that I think our colleagues who are campaigners and activists across the global south will be much more familiar with. One of the things that wasn't very widely reported about, I think it's begun to be widely reported about the horse meat scandal, is that some of the corporate vehicles that appear to have been used, or there have been allegations that they were used to introduce horse meat into the European supply chain. It's very difficult to discover actually who is behind those corporate vehicles. There was a series of Cyprus-registered companies with British Virgin Island shareholders, although it seemed to be clear who the kind of front people were for these companies, it wasn't at all clear who the actual owners and investors of these companies were. That story it would be incredibly familiar to, for example, my colleagues in Eastern DRC, who are looking at who is buying up land in an incredibly tiny and conflict-prone part of the country. You know, in some senses, the war in Eastern DRC is a war over land, although it's been described much more about a war over, you know, coltan or mineral resources. And it's that kind of, you know, it's interesting that we've suddenly got to a place where we recognise that regulatory failure in the food supply chain draws upon larger global systems of secrecy and opacity. And a lack of accountability.
That's really interesting, that, Joan. Yeah.
Can I just come back and say that it's also about the commoditisation of food, because it's happened with frozen beef products, because it's much easier to store them. You know, beef as a commodity is just another commodity, but you know, it's not with your fresh lamb shanks that it's happening. It's happening with frozen meat because it has a shelf life of up to 2 years. So you can buy it in one country, store it in another country, sell it on in a third country, and wait for your time to make the money. Now, clearly, there's been criminal activity at work there, but beef as a commodity, and it's very hard to tell a frozen minced beef flank from a frozen minced horse flank. I mean, I'm not sure. I've asked lots of people, and lots of people have said they wouldn't be able to tell the difference. You can't really. So
is that not an advert for horse meat in the sense that it's
No. My advice on horse meat is it's an industrial byproduct, and once you know that, you'll steer well clear.
Paul, do you want to move on to the macro solutions?
It's a fascinating range of solutions so far. I think going from horse meat and burgers in Europe to malnourished children in South Sudan just goes to show how actually complex this is. And we're talking about yes, a global food system, but actually very different systems which interact and interconnect at different parts. I think, as still the fundamental problem, the existential problem, and the question of survival for many people is dealing with malnourishment and poverty in developing countries. And I think the first solution really has to tackle that. And like Mike, maybe I'm a little bit more pessimistic on things like the G8 global governance forums, having lived through some of the climate change talks over the last few years. I'm not sure how much it's going to deliver. I think it ultimately comes down to national governance in those same countries, in the developing countries, in particular in Africa. And I think those countries and those governments need to take the actions to put in place integrated rural development plans. And that involves investing in infrastructure. We've heard about how difficult it is to get products to market, investing in research. It's about investing in markets. It's about supporting smallholders and small farmers to grow more food. That may involve subsidies, and it may also involve a managed relationship with world markets. And these countries have been told for many years to break down tariffs and open your markets, and the rest of the world will provide cheap food. That doesn't work so much anymore when food is twice expensive as it used to. So I think governments in these countries should probably look east as well rather than looking west. If you look at what Vietnam has achieved, what China and these countries have done over the last 30, 40 years, it's quite extraordinary. Vietnam was a food importer only about 20 years ago, and now is one of the biggest rice exporters in the world. All based on smallholder agriculture, average size of farm 1 to 2 hectares. So it can be done.
And Brazil.
And
But that's big business.
Yeah, and Brazil is a very interesting model because they've chosen a different path of development, which is much more about large-scale corporate mechanized agriculture, a lot of it backed by subsidized credit, and so there's a reason why they've gone that route. And yes, it's produced lots of food, but it's also had some very negative impacts in rural poverty and hunger. And you've had the flooding of people into the slums and the favelas, and so a very imbalanced and more unequal socioeconomic system. So I think, if you really care about the good of your small farmers, I think looking east rather than looking west in Brazil is a good place to start. So that's the first thing. We need to help farmers in those developing countries grow more food. Second,
So it is actually about growing more food. It's not just about the way that we handle the existing food.
I think if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, I think 43 out of 47 countries in sub-Saharan Africa are net importers of calories. Okay? So they're reliant on the rest of the world for food. They can't afford that food now. And so it's about growing more food in those countries to feed the people, but also to generate the economic growth and the incomes that are needed to kickstart the whole process of development. Second, I think, solution area for me is really, how you produce that food, okay, and what forms of agriculture we're talking about. I think this piece does apply just as much to developed countries in the UK as it does to developing countries. And there is a bit of a battle going on in farming at the moment about what's the way forward. Is it more chemicalized, industrial, mechanized agriculture, large-scale agriculture, or is it a more ecological form of agriculture which makes less use of external inputs, better use of natural processes, and is less polluting? And I think there are lots of examples of the latter, case studies, which are really successful, and they're normally done on quite a small scale. And the Vietnam sustainable rice certification is a good example because it, as well as using less water, it also uses less fertilizer, and so the farmer's paying less money to fertilizer companies. So there's lots of examples of success. So the question, how do we help scale them up? And I think in developing countries, poor countries, those models have been shown to double, triple production very effectively. The richer countries in Western Europe, it's a bit trickier because the current form of agriculture we have is very productive per hectare. And it may be we shift from a pure output model, we're looking at how much you produce per hectare, at the total range of functions which agriculture provides. And that's one is the amount of food, it's also the quality of food, it's the cost of production, and it's all those hidden environmental costs, which at the moment we're not really factoring in. And I think if you look at it that way, then some of these other models become quite attractive. And I think finally it gets to the point of waste, actually. And the fundamental reason why people waste food, I think most of it is still at the consumer level in rich countries like the UK, is because we take it for granted and it's maybe too cheap. For most people, they can't afford to throw away a third of their food. And it's a shocking statistic, but we all need to cherish our food more and take better care of it. And just a third point around the role for the private sector investment, and we talked about some of the negative ways in which corporations and investors can play, and I agree that there are threats. And I think when it comes to commodity markets, the role for investors is not investing in commodity speculation. But I think, to quote Lord Turner, the chairman of the Financial Services Authority, he said a lot of financial activity is socially useless. I think is a very good example. I don't think it causes the food crisis, but it does exacerbate volatility, and it doesn't help farmers actually hedge their risk, which is really needed. I think instead we need investment into into production, into infrastructure, into real assets, into developing small farmer agriculture in developing countries and more ecological agriculture in richer countries. And just to talk a little bit about a project I'm involved with, we're investing in a form of cattle grazing in Australia, which takes degraded grasslands, which changes how animals are managed by putting them into big herds, dividing land up into smaller paddocks and moving it around. And this system has been shown to produce incredible impacts in terms of reversing diversification, improving water use, while also actually doubling the amount of animals and therefore the production of grass-fed meat. So there are ways that we can do this, which can be both profitable for investors and good for the environment and the food system.
David?
So I think tackling child malnutrition, which is my main area of concern and is very much part of tackling what's wrong with the whole global food system, the first thing we have to know and understand is that it's not actually about food. What it's about is equity and poverty. The people who go hungry are the people who can't afford to buy the food that's there. And the people who can't afford to buy the food that's there are the people who are excluded, marginalised at the bottom of the heap for a whole variety of reasons. They might be affected by conflict, they might be new rural urban migrants, they might be farmers who've been displaced from their land, they might be farmers whose land is becoming more and more difficult to produce crops from because of the effects of climate change. But those are the poorest, those are the most marginalised, and we have to reach first the people who are at the bottom of the pile in order to solve the problem. And we know, to take the example of stunting, which is such a serious problem that is impacting on all of the futures of the people of the countries that are affected, where there are a number of countries where 40 to 50% of the under 5 children are affected by stunting, and they're stunting the chances of their countries to develop as well as the chances of those children. And we need to provide all kinds of things. We need water and sanitation, because if they get diseases, all the nutrition that they take in is lost and they suffer from malnutrition. We need immunisation against diseases. We need nutrition and hygiene information and education. We need their mums to go to school, because girls who are educated are less likely to have babies who suffer from stunting and malnutrition. We need cash transfers to help the poorest people to access the essentials of life. And how are we going to get all of those things? We need also to help communities develop resilience in case of disasters, which are going to happen more and more frequently. So aid is very important in providing all those things that I've just described. And I think it's fantastic that after 43 years, we've finally achieved this 0.7 target. We're the first country in the G8 to do it. We have a responsibility and an opportunity now to persuade the others to do it, and to make sure that we spend that money well and wisely. We know how to solve stunting. It costs $10 billion a year. The UK's increase that's just been announced in the aid budget could pay for half of that. And the other half is, according to the debates which have happened about how to end stunting, the other half is meant to be paid by the countries themselves. Those countries can only pay for that if they have some revenue from which to pay for it. So they need to be able to collect the taxes, which enable them to provide their share of solving that problem. We need to tackle climate change, and we need to do it in a way which doesn't actually spend the aid budget on solving a problem which we created by our carbon emissions. So in the Copenhagen Climate Conference, the international community committed by 2020 to finding $100 billion a year to spend on addressing climate change, half of it for helping communities that are affected to adapt, which means helping them to grow food in a climate-affected world. And we don't know yet where that money is coming from, but there are some ideas, some tax ideas, which we can have here. So we can tax the dirty fuels which are used to ship stuff around the world, and that would generate some of the money. We all know about the Robin Hood tax campaign and so on. So we need to find innovative ways to generate that 100 billion a year to tackle climate change. If we don't, then the chances of those poor and marginalised people to be able to have enough to eat are going to continue to be seriously challenged. But this year, change is possible. In a lot of these areas, we can help to increase the aid flows. We can get commitments of aid to helping small farmers and to addressing the issue of stunting. We could get that commitment to that 10 billion a year, and we could end chronic undernutrition of children. What's happening this year, we have a hunger summit in June, which is being called together by the UK government. Let's make sure that that hunger summit produces some results which actually stop children being hungry. We have the G8. It's the first time it's been here since 2005. We may all have our cynicism about what the G8 might be able to achieve, but it's partly up to us what it achieves. We can put pressure on the G8 through our own government and through the other governments, and we can make sure that the G8 does deliver some results on tax and transparency and land and so on. And it's not only the G8, it then goes to the G20 and all the other various international institutions which can make a difference. And we have our Prime Minister as co-chair of the high-level panel, which is looking at what are the world's development goals going to be after 2015. And that's a very important position, and he's sitting with some other important people. It's a shame he didn't get to Bali to take part in it, but I'm sure Justine Greening did a great job. But you know, the outcomes of that panel are actually incredibly important to the future of the children that I'm concerned about. And we can influence what the UK goes into that debate with. And I think this is why the If campaign is so, so important, because we can make a difference. Every individual in this room, in this country, can sign up to the If campaign, can make known their concern about this issue and how important it is, and can demand the kinds of changes that we've all been talking about, and we can make them happen. We could be the generation that ends chronic undernutrition of children. It is actually totally possible that in the next 10 years, that problem could be gone from the world. And I would love to be, you know, after my 40 years in the development business, leaving on a high note when I retire in a few years' time, knowing that that problem has been solved and it's possible and we can do it, and it's up to all of us to make the difference.
So even if only to give David a happy retirement.
That's the most important reason, of course.
I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions, but I think what we've had from this panel is a really interesting insight into the way that a lot of these problems join up. And I thought your summation was masterly, that this is not actually about food, it's about poverty and inequality. And I remember in 1985, when I was covering the famine in Ethiopia, it was clearly the case that the market worked. It moved the food away from the people who were hungry to the people who had money. And the issue of inequality and poverty is absolutely fundamental to this. And I think what we've seen from this panel is different facets of the different legs of the elephant. This is a huge creature. It can be tackled in lots of different ways. But the way that David suggested is probably the most accessible for most of us. And I would encourage you to go on the internet and look up more about the If campaign and commit yourselves to it. So thanks very much for coming.